It has been said that average people want you to stay average. Welcome to the Breaking Average podcast, the podcast designed to challenge you to break the mold that average has on the world. Each episode offers insights directly from those who choose to break average every day. Now, for the latest insights, here are your hosts, Paul Gustafson and Mike Harber.
Hey, welcome to the Breaking Average podcast. My name is Mike Harber. Joining me today is my co-host, Paul Gustafson. Hey, Paul, how are you today, my friend?
I'm doing great, Mike. Great to be with you and excited about our discussion today.
Yeah, it's going to be a good day. It's bright and early as we record our podcast sessions today for the Breaking Average podcast. We're continuing in our discussion, the 7 critical factors of team strong leadership, Paul, from your book, called Breaking Average. Tell us a little bit more about those 7 factors that we've been diving into.
Yeah, so 7 critical factors. We use the acrostic VICTORY, VICTORY. We are in, the third part with it, which is collaboration. So we're going to unpack that a little bit more, and excited to really kind of dive into this third element. It's going to be good.
Yeah, so this has been a good discussion, and if you're listening in on our Breaking Average podcast or the Empowered Living Show, we just want to say thanks for joining us. Hopefully you're enjoying the conversation. We would also like for you to go out and grab a copy of the book, Breaking Average. Paul wrote this in collaboration with several other co-authors, and we're talking about communication, collaboration, and today, Paul, we're going to dive into that third element of communication called interaction. But before we go any further, Paul, I'd love to just get a story. We like to kind of start each podcast episode with a story from the book. Why don't you dive into where you talked about interaction in this chapter?
Yeah, for sure. There's so many great stories, guys, and we invite all our listeners and the viewers to kind of be observant of these kind of stories of interaction, because they are out there, especially in the midst of COVID and everything else. It can be a challenge, I know, and I realize that, but there's also opportunities to see how people are interacting and make things happen. I love, we talked about Chick-fil-A before. There's a great story in the book about Chick-fil-A. Are you guys familiar, real quick, though? I'm not going to talk about the story, but I just want to highlight this. Do you guys recognize what this is right here?
That's
it's the wrong sauce. You got to get Polynesian sauce, Paul.
Yeah, but this sauce right here, the Polynesian sauce would have never happened if it wasn't for this sauce first. This Chick-fil-A sauce was invented here in the hometown where I live, and I was a guinea pig to that, which is pretty cool. And if you want to hear the story, read the story, check it out in the book, Breaking Average. It's a great story of interaction, of how that thing came about. Pretty cool. But what I want to do is highlight a different story. It's a Pixar story. There's a lot of Pixar stories, so I'm not going to unpack them all, but there's one that I really want to share. But you guys love Pixar, right? Toy Story? Mm-hmm. Is that like one of your favorites? It's certainly mine.
On repeat with a toddler in the house. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Although having
Can't say I've ever watched it.
Yeah, right. Mike, you've seen Toy Story. I know you have. And the making of Toy Story, and as you unpack that in his book, Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, fantastic book, by the way, if you haven't had a chance to read that. He shares a little bit of the struggles that took place, right? So Toy Story almost never happened. They almost pulled the plug. Disney wanted the script total rewrite. Woody was they kept changing the character of Woody in it. He was really a kind of a bad sheriff for a little bit, and obviously they fixed it. They got it right. Toy Story was a huge hit. It changed the whole game, right? If it wasn't for Toy Story, I don't know if we'd have the movies that we see today. That was just a game changer. Now, after Toy Story, there was another movie called A Bug's Life. Great movie. But when they were getting ready for A Bug's Life, Pixar's going through this metamorphosis. They just had a successful movie. They're an IPO. They've got their stock out there. And one of the co-founders, the CEO, Ed Catmull, is just going through this hollow, lost feeling, right? That, when you're goal oriented, you hit that goal and then you kind of lose your mojo. And he was sort of that. He lacked purpose. And to add to the discomfort, he discovers that there's another bigger issue, not just him, but within the team. There's a huge rift that's happening across the group between the creatives and the production departments. Now, what they did with Toy Story was they would bring down project managers, who out of Hollywood or wherever, and they're totally locked into the schedule and everything else. And Rick, we're going to have him here on in a minute. He can probably share a little bit more about the mindset of a product manager, at least a typical one. Pixar had to change that whole story, because what was happening was there was a lot of angst against product managers because they're totally locked into the details and micromanaging and things like that. And so the project managers themselves are feeling a little bit hurt and impacted and criticized in terms of what they're doing. And so they were real reluctant to do a Bug's Life. They were reluctant to continue on. And so what Catmull had to do was kind of jump in and figure out what was going on. And the problem that he discovered turned into an opportunity. And so it created for him and all of Pixar a whole new sense of purpose. He says this. He says, we had made the mistake of confusing the communication structure with the organizational structure. I love that quote. I double highlighted that in the book, by the way. He made the mistake of confusing the communication structure with the organizational structure. And so they gathered the team together. He shares this and he says, this is what they said to him. Hey, going forward, anyone should be able to talk to anyone else at any level, at any time, without fear or reprimand. Communication would no longer have to go through hierarchical channels. And he shares this. He says, we realized that our purpose was not merely to build a studio that made hit films, but to foster a creative culture that would continually ask questions. Guys, what they wanted to do is build a sustainable creative culture. And they did that. After 23 films, I think they've done that. They've done that in spades. And it took a lot of work. And it took a repurpose on that. And it's really about this topic of collaboration and interaction. And, I think maybe other than the Chick-fil-A sauce, that's the best story I can share in terms of interaction is the Pixar one, that Pixar one.
Yeah, that's a great story, Paul, and to bring this this element of communication, collaboration in. I probably failed in my duty as a father. I honestly don't think I've ever watched Toy Story. I think I've seen bits and pieces of it. I know when we're going to bring Rick and Diane in a minute. They're experts in these types of kiddie movies. I don't have time for those things.
Dang, this is a adults and kids movie, man. I'm telling you.
Yeah, I know I've heard a lot of good things about Toy Story. I need to go watch that. But I love this idea of, what you brought, the story kind of behind the scenes, right? I work a lot in healthcare, and communication, collaboration, interaction is critical in healthcare, and it fails so many times. I mean, and one of the things I do in the leadership development work I do in the hospitals is try to break down these silos between departments where they should be interacting about a patient to make sure the healthcare system is transferred appropriately from one department to another, but it often fails along the way. So we're going to dive a little bit more into that today. I want to bring Diane and Rick into the conversation. Let them maybe talk about Toy Story a little bit and this idea. Rick obviously is a project manager. He can speak into that and how important it is as well. Good morning, Diane. Good morning, Rick. How are y'all?
Good morning.
Morning. You have 4 movies to catch up on. I'm just letting you know, Mike.
Yeah.
4.
There's 4.
Yeah.
4
There's
Toy
4.
Stories?
Yes, there is. There's 4
my
of
God.
them. So
Holy cow. See, I didn't even know that. I knew there was one.
My favorite Toy Story anecdote, though, is I had a doctor who was sharing this with me, but he had bought one of those devices for his children that basically, I don't know how it works. I think it looks at the subtitles, and if a bad word is coming, it bleeps it out or mutes it. And very popular devices. And he had his children watching that, and he said he just heard this beep, 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 and he's like, what are my kids watching? And he went in there and it was Toy Story, and his son looked at him and said, Dad, why are they bleeping out Woody's name? And he was like, so that's where it gives technology the unintended consequence sometimes of uncomfortable conversations. I thought that was a funny story.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's where the technology was definitely breaking average. Right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a funny story.
Yeah, Diane, why don't you get us on the right track here? Clean
Let us
us up
segue
a
us
little
back
bit.
into our-
Talk about the three elements
Elements.
and critical factors for communication.
The three elements of collaboration, and communication starts with one of them,
collaboration.
right?
Yeah.
It happens with that commitment for the leader to communicate. And so Dad was well intended. The machine just didn't work for him. Cooperation. And so collaboration happens when we have that whole spirit of cooperation modeled by the contributors. And the story that you just told, Paul, was how it was being interfered with, actually. And then today we're going to talk about interaction and how collaboration happens when we have that whole common desire for the team to interact. We need time for that interaction. And I'm really excited about the project manager pieces of that. And Rick, what you're going to bring to the rest of the story that Paul just, set us up with so nicely.
Yeah, it's really interesting when we hear these quotes or read these stories, because I think, again, we're gonna come up with the word of authenticity that they say all the time. Is I watched that happen with the Six Sigma boom, right? Toyota brings out this wonderful way of being highly collaborative and interactive, and everybody's like, oh, we're gonna go copy that, but they do so inauthentically. The quote I wanted to share here is actually one of mine. It's something I say often, which it taught my kids this, is that every interaction is a transaction and somebody's buying. Literally every single conversation you have, regardless of if you're just having a conversation with the customer service person, or you're at the grocery store and talking to the register person, it doesn't matter. This interaction right now that we're having with the listener, somebody's buying. They're either buying into what we're saying, or they're buying in that they need to check out of this, right? But every single interaction is a transaction, and there's debits and credits being made. And the question is, are you depositing or withdrawing from that bank of strong relationships and trust? That's why a lot of leaders struggle with teams. They walk in and just think that they can just start laying down new methodologies or changing the way people work, but they don't have the relationship capital built because they haven't made enough deposits, because they haven't looked at every single interaction as that transaction to make sure that you're building trust.
That's good, man. I love that. We got some tweetable comments there from Rick Morris, man. That's good. Every interaction is a transaction that somebody is buying. That makes you think. I appreciate you sharing that. That's awesome. We want to encourage you guys to go visit our Breaking Average website. We've got some content, some resources there. We would love for you to get your hands on, and we want to give you tools to help you communicate and interact. And I think it's so important, this whole element of interaction. And, guys, another book that comes to mind is To Sell is Human. And he talks about this idea of attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. And I think it's important for folks to have that. And that's one of the things that we've done with the website, is try to provide some tools to help with those attunement elements. And we also are curious about leaders. So if you know a leader who's making an impact, who is interacting in a way that's breaking average and making a difference in this world that we can interview, let us know. Just go to breakingaverage.com and go to the podcast link, and you'll see a link for leaders. We want to interview leaders.
Yeah, that's good, Paul, and I appreciate that. And certainly there are tools, not tunes, on the website, right? I don't think there are any singers in our group. I don't know. Rick may be able to sing a little bit.
No,
It's Disney tunes. We always like to highlight other people as well, right? And have sponsors on our show. A great leader and a contributor to the book is who we want to highlight today. Rick, why don't you tell us a little bit about our sponsor for today's show?
Our own Jolly Giant, our own Paul Bunyan, our own 7'4", 190. I'm not going to judge his weight. But honestly one of the greatest people that I've gotten an opportunity to meet through the John Maxwell team and continue a relationship. He's my grumpy grandpa, man. I love him to death. But we talk about every interaction's a transaction somebody's buying. This gentleman, he just had a way of sizing me up that said, I want to know him. Like, I want to know this guy. And he's one of the coolest people I've met. And he is the unofficial mayor of Birmingham, Alabama, Richard Mobley. He's got an incredible company, S2-24 Group. Has a great Live to Lead event that he does every year here in town. But I think it's a great one when we start talking about interaction and collaboration, because one of the coolest things about that Live to Lead is literally almost every table has a different John Maxwell team member, Birmingham, kind of hosting it. He gets everybody involved and gets a lot of people focused to work together. He's a leadership expert. He's an executive and key leader coach. He's obviously certified in DISC. He does a lot of strategic planning, training workshops, but he has been, a high-ranking executive for many years and knows what it takes to run a successful team, an interactive team. And you can find him at 74group.com, and you spell out the numbers. So it's SEVENFOUR group.com. That does not stand for his height, although we believe it does.
Yeah, I think so.
There's actually, and as a matter of fact, why don't you call him up and ask him what it means, and he'll tell you all about it. So thanks to Richard for sponsoring the show.
Yeah, great to have Richard as a collaborator in the book, also as a sponsor of the show. And he's one of our favorites. Love what he brings. His humility, his humble leadership is certainly fantastic. We want to dive into our conversation now around interaction, the part from our chapter on collaboration. This is one of the three elements. And we want to just kind of have discussion, Diane, Rick, Paul, around what does interaction mean? What is it really? And why is it important? So, Diane, let's start with you today. What does interaction really mean? Why is it important to breaking average and teamwork?
Right. And so interaction, I found this quote and I have it embodied almost and sitting right in front of me. And because interaction is it is actually a transaction, but there also needs to be that connection. And so the quote that I have in front of me, it's a connection is that energy that exists between two people when you feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive a substance and strength from the relationship. And when you were talking about the transactions that we're having, Rick, that connection, it also influences whether it's a deposit or a withdrawal. And I think that that's so important and a critical part of the interactions that we have, that we are very intentional on how we're doing it, especially from a leader's standpoint. When Catmull was coming back and saying, there's something that's wrong here, what do we need to do? And it was so important how that org structure can interfere in our interactions, right? We have that whole command and control. We have that chain of command. And really, sometimes you just need to ask the question to the source and being free to do that. And how Catmull making that decision to be able to do that was so incredibly changing for the whole team. Recently, I was in a different networking event, and there was a woman who was there, and she was talking exactly about that, and creating those connections and those interactions. And she was new to the organization that she had just entered into, and she's a really high I personality. She was having conversations with everybody she met. She's like, hey, my name is Anna. How are you today? And when she walked into this elevator, she met this individual who was standing there, this man who was standing there. He's like, hey, how are you? What are you doing? And she started to talk about how she contributed to the organization. Well, come to find out, it was the CEO of the organization, and they started having these monthly conversations. And people were looking at her like, how did that happen? And so I thought it was so important that when you have the ability to interact with just the right person, regardless of their title or position, it opens all of those doors and how we can collaborate at such a different and higher level. Mm-hmm. And Rick, I know you're going to talk about that a little bit more.
You're going to have to hold me back on this topic, I think. Shut me down, time box me in the next. I think the greatest example I heard, and it's not mine, but it's one that I've used multiple times, was when you start talking about interaction, there's your thought pattern of what the interaction is, and then there's your customers. And if you think about it for airport, you think of Delta, well, and not to pick on Delta, but let's just use them. When you have a flight that lands, at 10 o'clock in the morning, you have an expectation of when you're going to get out the door. Right. And so when you're a customer, you don't care about the interactions between the departments. You just care that your end-to-end process works. So let's say they land at 9:50, right? But then they get there and the gate, the gate's not available for them because you're early, and now you've got to switch gates, and then it takes a little while for the luggage to get out of there, and so I expected to be out the door by 10:30, and I'm walking out at 11. I'm upset at Delta. But if I go look at how they track their metrics, they're going to say that flight came in early because it's wheels up to wheels down. That interaction of how all those different teams work together is how we judge the overall experience. When you think about working with an IT department in your company, your computer's broken. You don't care if it's the network card or the cable or wireless or whatever the issue, the computer's broken. But then you've got the people within the departments going, well, my department's fine. So the whole realm of interaction, you start thinking about end-to-end process and how the collaboration and interaction flows all the way through. Coming back to what I was saying earlier, Paul, in terms of people inauthentically put in methodologies, and I watch that happen all the time. You did a little mini agile training right there in the book, and it talked about the Moscow method, which I use all the time, and it talks about points and how to get teams to collaborate. And I just had this interaction a couple of days ago with this new executive who came in, and we're nearing the end of what we call an MVP release, which if you don't know what that means, you can read it right there in the Breaking Average book. But we're coming right at the end of an MVP release, and then we've got a whole new release coming after that. And this person's coming in at the end and is just shaking everything up and asking questions like, why does the team do points? Why don't they do things like hours? And I had remarked, I said, points is a core covenant of Agile. And he jumped all over me. He was like, no, it's not. I've been doing Agile for 7 years and it's not a core covenant of it. And I was like, but it is. And this is where the authenticity starts to come in, because it really has nothing to do about points. First of all, my job as a project manager is to translate what's happening with the team to what the end result is in terms of cost and in terms of time. When is it going to be done? Now, whether we do that by hours, everybody knows that it's about 40 hours a week, right? So if something's 160 hours, you're going to divide that and say, it's about 4 weeks. Right now, there's a lot of other think, well, Agile works the same way. Once a team establishes its velocity, if they'll say it's 50 points, per 2-week sprint. If you got 200 points, about 5 sprints, right? I mean, it works the same way how you translate it. So it really doesn't matter, except that the team gets together to agree on what the point values mean.
Yeah.
Now, that is so important. Now, that sounds silly, but story points to story points don't mean the same thing to 2 different teams, right? And people get frustrated with that. Well, what's 5 points mean? I don't know. Ask the team. The difference here is that they've collaborated and interacted and agreed on a scale, and then they start to hold each other accountable to that scale. And then they become predictable to that scale, which then allows us to do what we have to do in the translation. So my job every day is to hear what they're trying to do in terms of effort. Now, remember, a team, though, they speak in value, right? And executives think in time and cost. And that's what project managers do, is translate between those, right? But if the team doesn't believe in their own value, then they're not going to collaborate and interact. So the key tenet of Agile becomes allowing them to create their points, but here's why. It's an interaction. And that interaction becomes a transaction, and they're buying into that team.
Wow, that's great, man. That's guys, you just got a 101, maybe a 201 level training bit on Agile, because Agile isn't, and Rick, you can comment on this too. Agile isn't just for software development. Mm-mm. It is for any kind of project, and it is a fantastic interaction tool, right? I mean, you've been able to apply this outside of software development, right?
Oh yeah, I did. I'll give you a sales example real quick, and I use it all the time. Agile is about asking the right question. So, for instance, old school technology says we're going to go get a data warehouse. Why? Well, we need to get all of our metrics together, right? Why? So we can improve our sales process. Okay. So what they do is they go spend a 2-year project, investing in a tremendous amount of technology, but they don't know what they're going to do with it. Mm-hmm. If we're going to apply that to an agile thinking, we say, okay, what do you want to do with the data warehouse? Well, we need to do local market plans. Great. What are local market plans? Well, we take 50 accounts and we plan how to sell and cross sell. Okay. Well, why can't we just take one person, grab 50 accounts, and start to build out what we're going to do with that before we start to invest in technology to see if it's going to work, right? To prototype it. And finally, we got to our first agile question was, how do we know that's the best 50 accounts? That those are the best 50 accounts per sales rep? So that's a great question. How would we know that? And the whole thing shifted into a whole different environment. That's value-based thinking. That's when you're getting agile, is you start thinking about how we're going to do it. The second thing you do with that is I could then take 5 salespeople, run them through a prototype manually to prove out what's going to work. And then as we're building it out for everybody else, those people are off and running. So people think agile is faster, and it is in a way. What it's faster in is delivering value. Yeah. And what I mean by that is instead of waiting 2 years to flip the switch for everybody, we operationalize it in the first 3 or 4 months. And as we're rolling everybody out, we're generating revenue, but the work still takes the same amount of time to do, if that makes sense. It's all about bringing value faster.
Yeah. And our next podcast, we're going to be talking about credibility. When you think about agile, and really you're talking about how to build credibility. When we talk about MVPs, and yes, read the book. We'll probably highlight MVPs in our next podcast, but it's so powerful, this whole interaction. Guys, we have an opportunity in front of us every single day to interact, to connect with other people. And interaction, it's a two-way element. It's two-way collaboration. We want to make sure we're 2 ears, 1 mouth. We're listening. We're tuned in. And, interaction is the goal. When we talk about true collaboration, the goal is really interaction. You know that you're collaborating when you have interaction happening. Whereas just we've talked about communication, we've talked about cooperation. Those are powerful. Those are a means to an end, right? Interaction has to be human to human. That's the goal. We can't necessarily rely on technology to accomplish our interactions. We can't rely on the IT, the infrastructure of technology to make it happen. You and me, as human to human, we have to satisfy that interaction goal. We got to be intentional about that. So interaction requires intention and action. The intention to collaborate, yes. The action to communicate, yes. And that combination is what helps cultivate interaction. And when you get to the end, guys, is the opportunity for chemistry and culture, just like the 23 films that Pixar has produced. It's just amazing if you look at their story and how they've really worked really hard at making sure that they have an interaction culture. And we can do the same. Mike, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, let me see if I can bring us back down out of the clouds. Y'all are talking way over my head with all this agile and MVP, and these kind of man. I was listening to Rick. I'm like, man, I didn't realize he was that smart. I've never heard him talk about these kind of things before. And maybe I'm just not very smart. It's good. I love that conversation. I learned. That's one thing I love about, the collaboration that we have on the Breaking Average podcast, right? Is we're learning from each other, these different things. I'm going to take us a little bit different route. Because I think when we talk about in interaction, we're all saying interaction, right? It's really interaction between two people. Each of you have talked about between two people, right? It's this interaction happens between two people. I love Rick's quote about it. It's a transaction, right? But that somebody's buying, but that transaction happens with an inner action, just stay with me for a minute. So when I'm talking with someone, when I'm having an interaction with someone where we're communicating and collaborating between two people, there's an interaction that takes place, right? There's this thinking, and depending on my communication style or what I'm saying or how that's received by the other person, there's going to be an interaction, this thinking that I'm instigating in this other person. Oftentimes Rick and I pick on each other, right? We're having a little bit of fun because we like to talk about SEC football or sports. And so really I'm pushing on Rick, his interaction, this thinking he has about, he thinks his team's the best. I think my team's the best. Right. But when we have this interaction between two people, the real question is okay, what is the interaction? What kind of thinking am I creating in that other person? And is it going to drive an action that is going to be, appropriate for whatever, project that we're trying to drive forward, right? That's how it really works with this project management that Rick is talking about. So I think it's important when you think about communication, and that's what we're really talking about, our collaboration. This chapter is what interaction, what's the thinking that you're creating within the other person? Is it going to be something that drives that transaction forward or stalls it? Does it create resistance in that, which we're going to talk a lot more about in our next podcast when we dive into the trust factor, Paul. And I think that's so important. And it's important to make the distinction between, especially for our listeners that are around the world, when we talk about interaction versus interaction and really what happens from a communication standpoint. So let's transition a little bit to this idea of how we drive interaction or how we cultivate this interaction within others. Because as a leader, it's important, right? We're talking about breaking average. We're talking about these 7 critical factors for team strong leadership. Rick, we'll come to you first with this point. How do we cultivate interaction with others that are on the team as well?
Yeah, I think it's first by understanding that do we have shared values? A lot of people coming back to Agile will say, they're going to Agile because it's the hottest methodology, but what they want to do is build culture, just like we were talking about at Pixar, right? They were trying to build this new culture. Well, culture is based on shared values. And my friend Colin Ellis is a culture expert. He's got a quote that says, culture change will either happen by evolution or revolution. I love that quote, right? It's either going to evolve as a group or they're going to revolt against the leadership. And so often when I'm doing transformations, or a lot of times I do transformation rescues, and almost every single time I go into a company, they go, we went to Agile, but our teams still aren't performing, at a high rate. They're not high performing teams. How do we build high performing teams? And the question always is, well, what are you doing for team building? And they go, nothing. You're like, oh, so it's just, we went Agile, boom, we're all high performing teams. So I'll give you my number one strategy. And it's something we're all familiar with. But it clicked into me when I was exposed to roundtables. And when you start to look at, especially what John Maxwell has done with the transformation of countries, if you hear the word Agile transformation, if we're talking about transformation of countries, you do that through roundtables, small groups. Right. And it's something that I got to experience in Costa Rica. I thought it was, life-changing for me. So I decided to pursue it a little bit further and went and got certified by Global Priority Solutions, and immediately saw this connection between roundtables and Agile teams, or just culture change within an organization. But a time-boxed 30-minute meeting where you pick a culture value, like communication, like interaction, like forgiveness, like trust, and basically have a structured conversation where everybody shares. And what you start to get out of that is this interaction between the team where they begin to understand where each other's coming from. And once they understand where each other's coming from, they begin to bond. When they bond, they begin to trust. When they trust, they become high performing. So if you want to build high performing teams within your organization, give them an opportunity to discuss and share their values.
Absolutely. And Rick, that's so important, because we're talking about interactions, and we're always talking about people. And back to that connection, by making and creating that space, we used to do this when we were having engagement conversations, right? We would bring in these focus groups. We want to know where we're at in the culture. And every year we're going to do this employee engagement survey. And it's that let's collect the data, but now what are we going to do with the data? And so what we would do is bring in those focus groups and small groups like that. And what was important too was who was conducting that focus group, who was the facilitator within the focus group. Because if it was 2 levels up that was conducting that focus group, there was not that safety factor. So that smaller piece, we need to make sure that table is a level playing field, and there's that comfort and that safety that we keep bringing in. Because if people aren't feeling safe or connected, that shuts down the interaction. And I think that's super important to remember, that there's humans at the table. We're feeling, we're thinking, and we have emotions. And so those are all those parts that are in it to help bring that interaction into it. And I love the smaller interaction, so that every single person can be heard without judgment is the biggest piece of bringing that interaction together. Then we can move forward successfully towards that goal.
This is such a great topic, guys. And I can't think of a topic that's more important than interaction right now, especially in the midst of a pandemic. I mean, we're still in the midst of it. And the interactions that we have, the ones that you and I have, like before we start the record button on these podcasts, and even during the recording, they're so meaningful, right? Because it creates that sense of connection with somebody else. And I love what everyone's sharing here this morning, but I really want to make sure we emphasize to our listeners, to everybody, and to us on this podcast as we record this, the importance of this thing. If we get one thing right, let's get interaction right. Because interaction kind of unpacks everything else that we talk about when we talk about team strong leadership and breaking average. If we can create interaction, we can put a man on the moon. We can put a man on Mars, which is what Elon Musk is trying to do. Interaction is the key to our success in terms of what we're doing and what we're pursuing. And here's the beauty of it. Interaction isn't something that is a marathon per se, although it's something we need to do every day. It can just take a little bit of time, just a little bit of interaction. You can have an interaction with somebody that you meet at a store, at Starbucks. You can have an interaction. It doesn't have to be long to have an interaction. And the word that I wrote, as I'm listening to you guys, I like to always have a pen and paper right next to me, because there's some thoughts that are coming out, guys, and I hope everybody's just capturing some of the things that everybody's saying. Like Mike's comment on inner communication. How true is that? What are we saying to ourselves? What's that critic saying to ourselves? And what's that maybe not so critic, maybe the angel? I don't know what you call that, but what are we saying? What belief are we saying to ourselves? What's that interaction that's taking place? Because that interaction is going to expose itself on our interactions with other people. Our outlook drives our output, and our output always comes back around as input. And so key to that. So here's some strategies and tactics that I thought of that were really important. We started with stories. A story makes a connection with people. We want attunement, right? We talked about attunement, Dan Pink stuff. Stories are really powerful. Questions are really powerful. Being vulnerable sometimes. If you're a leader, I think you've got to be vulnerable. If you're not a leader, you got to raise your hand sometimes and ask the question. That vulnerability just creates an instant connection if it's done right. So be empathetic as a leader as people ask those questions and allow that vulnerability. It's just powerful. That allows for interaction. Candor. We'll talk about a little bit more of candor. That's something. I love how Catmull says, we didn't want to say, let's just be honest with each other, although that's important, because the meaning of honesty sometimes can be hurtful and harmful if it's not done right. What we choose to use is a word called candor. And it's a better meaning, because what we want to do is, we're not trying to be accusatory towards somebody. That doesn't help anybody. If we accuse folks, what we want to do is draw attention to something that somebody else can't see. It's the other side of the beach ball kind of concept when you think about it, and that's candor. Those are some strategies: stories, questions, being vulnerable, candor. Mike, I know you got some more thoughts on this, because you have helped me on this with interaction a few years ago. You really helped me in this area. So this is a sweet spot for you too, but I'd love to get your thoughts on how do we cultivate interaction by others.
So much good stuff in this interaction we're having, about this conversation, Paul. We could go a lot of different ways. And I don't want to rehash everything that we've talked about, but one of the things you said is if we get anything right, we've got to get interaction right. And I think that's important, Paul. And the way we do that as individuals, number one is we have to kind of set our own ego aside, right? And that's really, really hard. I mean, look at what's going on in the world today. Everybody's got an ego. Everybody has an agenda. They want their voice heard and know their voice is right. And see, an interaction, the idea of interaction is not to be right, is to move in the right direction. And what Rick said, is you got to have common values, right? And so move forward in the right direction, not be right, but move forward in the right direction around a common value, around a common goal, around a common purpose. And then, Diane talked about making sure whoever she used the term facilitator. I like the word leader. I think there's always got to be a leader in the room, but the leader doesn't have to be the facilitator, right? The leader can assign a facilitator in those team discussions. And I think, the leader has to make sure all the voices are heard, especially in a team environment. We've got to make sure all the voices are heard, that no one's left out. There's a lot of things that we've talked about in all of our discussions in the past, understanding who the people are in the room, and that some people are going to want to share in the room and some people are going to want to share, when the room closes up, right? They don't want to share in front of others. So the leader has to be aware of that, making sure they're asking all the right questions, and then also making sure that one person doesn't dominate the conversation as well. Look, I'm a high D personality. I love to dominate conversations. I work really hard to not be that person in most team meetings. And so I force myself to listen. I was just in a very high stakes room a couple of days ago, and I had to force myself to listen and listen and listen again. I mean, literally for minutes before I jumped in and added what I was thinking or what I wanted to add. And I think that's where the leader has to come in, is to force people to listen, to ask the right questions, to make sure all the voices are heard, and make sure the egos are set aside, and that we're moving forward, not to be right, but in the right direction as well.
So good. Yeah, because it creates a sense of belonging, and we want that, and so great points, guys. I want to highlight again somebody who's been helpful for me and other people, who's created insight. He actually co-wrote the section on the insight factor in the book Breaking Average, Richard Mobley, and he is a sponsor today. Richard, thanks for being our sponsor and everything that you do. Guys, visit Richard. He's definitely somebody that you want to have some interaction with. Go to 74group.com and check out Richard. So, Mike, fantastic. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too. Great interaction, great collaboration. As we wrap up this chapter on collaboration in Paul's book, Breaking Average: 7 Critical Factors to Team Strong Leadership. I also, want to give a shout out to Richard. Richard is a fantastic guy. If you're someone who's looking, trying to figure out how to align your faith walk with your business journey, Richard's the guy that can help you do that as well. So make sure you visit him. I want to thank Diane Kane and Rick Morris for joining us in today's discussion, as they always do. It's been a great, great time of learning from both of them as well. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Diane, any closing thoughts or last ideas you have around this idea of interaction?
It takes energy, just energy and time. Make sure you've got it.
Energy is key, right? How about you, Rick?
It has to be planned in. You can't just, to your point, everybody needs to be heard, and there's got to be you can't just bring everybody in a room and say, hey, we're going to discuss this value. There's got to be some structure around it. So look into the roundtable method and utilize that to build some high performing teams.
Yeah, I think that's key. You know, one of the concepts, we're all fans of John Maxwell. One of the concepts from his book, Everyone Communicates If You Connect, is planning, right? Planning those conversations. Prior planning. You can't just walk into an interaction with a group of people and hope that it happens, especially if it's never happened before, right, Rick? I mean, that's important. I mean, you can't just walk. Oh, we're agile. What are you doing to team build? I love that example. Oh, you've done nothing, right?
Right.
Well, if you've done nothing before, then you need to plan something to move those interactions and collaborations forward as well. Paul, let's end the show with our tip and challenge. How about your tip and challenge for our listeners today?
Yeah, there's so many good suggestions, lots of great advice. I just encourage everybody to go back, re-listen to this podcast. There are some great takeaways in here. I will share a quick tip and challenge. Ed Catmull. I learned a lot from that book. And if you're an Audible fan, what a great book to listen to. One of the best Audible books read that I've listened to in a long time. And, the thing that inspired me about Ed Catmull is, don't let your title fool you, all right? Just because you're a CEO or wherever you're at doesn't mean that you don't have the opportunity and the need and the value to interact. Rick talked about values. Let that be one of your values, maybe a role or responsibility that you have that, you know what, I'm the interaction guy. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're an introvert or extrovert. You can still interact. It just takes a few minutes just to connect with somebody and do that. Ask somebody how they're doing. Just check on them. Just let them know you're thinking about them. And there's so many different ways to interact, and let that be a role and a responsibility. Nobody's going to discredit you at all. It's going to be welcomed by your team. It creates a sense of belonging. That's the challenge. I love it. Catmull's, he's got a great quote that I think is important, that I think about. He says this: put smart, passionate people in a room together, charge them with identifying and solving problems, and encourage them to be candid with one another. That's the interaction guy. The interaction guy is going to pull those people in that room, and we're going to identify. And we do that, the four of us together. We talk about some of the challenges that are out there, and we try to be candid with one another, and we have fun, as you can tell between Mike and Rick on their SEC stuff. But we all challenge each other in a good way. And we want to add value. And you can do that too. Let that be your role and responsibility. Be the interaction guy or gal. How about you, Mike? What's your tip or challenge?
What was the title of the book, Paul? Again, I may have missed that from Ed Catmull.
It's got Buzz Lightyear as the image on the front cover, Mike. It's called Creativity Inc.
Creativity Inc. Okay, I'll have to listen to that. So I've got
to
four
watch Toy
movies,
Story first.
4 movies to watch, and a book to listen to or read. I'll have to check that book out. My tip and challenge, Paul. Another great book for our Breaking Average listeners is a book called Breaking Average, written by Paul Gustafson. 7 critical factors for team strong leadership. And one of our co-authors, contributing authors for this book and this chapter on collaboration is Gloria Burgess. And I think we highlighted Gloria last time, but she shared 4 tips, Paul. So I'm going to share her tips instead of my tips. How about this? Yeah. 4 tips in the book in this final chapter. Number 1, take time to listen. Very, very important, right? Take time to listen. And one of the things that I teach leaders is always ask 3 or 4 questions before you give input, right? So take time to listen has to be followed by asking the right questions. That's one of Gloria's tips as well. So asking the right questions, taking time to listen to the answers to those questions. Keep up the tempo, right? The leader's job is to keep up the tempo, to not let us get stuck in all the questions, all the fears, all the doubts, but keep the momentum and the tempo moving forward. And then learn to laugh together. I think it's important. Look, sometimes we can get so focused on the goal, the mission that we're trying to accomplish that we forget to laugh. And, I try to, you guys are pretty boring. So I try to bring some laughter and some, some fun into our conversation as well. That's my way of doing that, is making some kind of dry-witted, comment like I just did, just to kind of keep laughter up. So our challenge for you, get a copy of the book, Breaking Average. There's some great tools. Rick talked about Agile. There's some, in this chapter alone, there's some great tools for you as a leader to use some of those Agile techniques and interaction techniques to help drive your team forward. And communication is the number one skill for any leader. So learn to communicate and you can lead anyone. That's my tip and challenge for our listeners today, Paul.
Fantastic. Guys, it's been so enjoyable. Thank you, Mike, for sharing. Thank you, Rick and Diane, and to our sponsor, Richard Mobley. Thank you for being our sponsor. Guys, we are really appreciative of all our viewers and listeners, and your comments and feedback is so helpful for us, and we want to continue to add value. Interact with us. Please visit our website, breakingaverage.com.
Yep, so good. Hey, great conversation today, Paul, Rick, Diane. Loved what the value that you've brought to the conversation today as well. Once again, we continue to be inspired by the opportunity to serve leaders around the world, listeners around the world, help drive these interactions between leaders around the world. Continue to come back and listen to the Breaking Average podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for listening to the Breaking Average podcast. If you loved what you heard, please take a moment to subscribe. All opinions and comments expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not reflect the opinions or views of any of the advertisers, producers, or platforms. This show was produced by R2 Multimedia. A special thank you to Milestone Melodies for our theme music. As you continue your day, what is one action that you can apply from this podcast to your life? Tune in for our next episode as we continue to challenge everyone to break average.